Did you? Okay.
Well, hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, wherever you are.
Nice to see you, you massive people, you. Holy. We got a lot of people on this phone call, and that's a great thing. And it's we're heading into some uncharted waters here. Though I have been recently in a 200-person Zoom meeting, so that looked like a piece of cake. But so we are grateful that you're with us, and we are humbled and somewhat overwhelmed by the response of you good people to come and join us for this opening session of God in Hollywood. I know that maybe some of you have participated with us before in this series. This is, I think, maybe the fourth go-around for us on God in Hollywood, and this will certainly be a very different experience than the ones we've had before in the campus center, but we're going to do the best we can as we try to let this technology give us the chance to have some conversation.
This little red record up there.
Let me go over a few ground rules so that we can have our the most
maybe they're recording
full time as possible. So number one, everyone gets to mute themselves. So if you can find your mute button, and that's usually, at least on my computer, way down at the bottom in the far left-hand corner.
You want us to do it now?
Yes, please. That way we can avoid having dogs barking in the background, and we can cell phones going off, and arguments between spouses, all those kinds of things. We're going to try to avoid all that background noise so that we can hear one another. And so does everybody have any luck? Looks like just about everybody is
I'll push it.
muted, except for the one person I'm continuing to hear. So, yep, good. So let me tell you what we're going to do. That's obviously it's going to be a little different than what we've had before. We are going to spend a chunk of time with me just sort of sharing with you a little bit about the movie that we all had the chance to watch. Hopefully, most of us had the chance to watch. And we're going to, I'm going to spend some time talking about that. And then when it comes time for discussion, I'm going to invite you to take a look right now down at the bottom of your screen. If you move your mouse over, you'll see the button at the bottom there. I know some of you are Zoom pros and you know about chat. But if you press that button, a screen will come up, I think, on the right-hand side of your screen. And that will be the place where if you have a comment or a question that you'd like to ask, all you need to do is type down at the bottom of that screen. It says type message here. Just type, you don't have to worry about who you're sending it to. You'll send it usually automatically to everyone. But all you need to do is say your name and that you'd like to make you have a question or a comment. You don't need to say what the comment is. You don't need to say what the question is. All you need to do is just say, I'd like to ask a question. I'd like to make a comment. And Pastor Mingy, who's on the call, she is going to be the one who will guide us and call on the people who have alerted us that they want to make a comment or want to make a question or present a question. So I hope that's that explains that process all right for you. You can make those comments and questions as I'm talking. And then we will get to them once I'm done talking about the movie and about the background of the movie and so on and so forth. So the way for you to acknowledge that you understand that is to simply give me a thumbs up. So am I making sense to everybody? Excellent, excellent. And if I'm not making any sense, you're out of luck. So We are grateful. We do, I guess I said, encourage you to keep that mute button on. And then when we do call on you, just be ready to unmute yourself so that we can hear your question or hear your comment. And then I, of course, will have a chance to respond to that. So I think that goes for all of what I need to share with you to get started. One of the other things that we're not going to be able to do with this technology, at least until we find a way to perfect it, is I know you're used to me showing clips of the movies that we've seen together, and to highlight a couple of scenes here and there, but not able to do that right now. But so you'll have to use your imagination as I describe to you certain parts of the movie. So to that end, I think we've covered all the bases, and allow me to pray for us as we begin our conversation. Lord, thank you for this chance to be together. It's great to see familiar friends, perhaps people we haven't seen for quite a while, and we're thankful that we have this opportunity to lay eyes on each other and to take some time to reflect and wonder together about the gift of cinema and the gift of this particular movie, and that it may inspire us and help us to think more about our own journey with you and the ways by which we can learn to become more like you. We thank you for the gift of the church and for the chance that this occasion brings us together. For we ask it in Christ's name, amen. So, wanted to start off by giving a little bit of background on this movie, and my presentation is full of all sorts of disclaimers. Disclaimer number one is that I am not a movie expert. I am not a cinema guy necessarily, except that I watch a lot of movies, and I have movies I like and movies I don't like. And I've told people all along when I've done this series that the real reason why I do this series is that it just gives me a chance to watch movies I like. So, and that's the nice thing about being the teacher. You get to decide which movies we're going to talk about. And I want to also get your acknowledgement of the enormous amount of restraint that I have exercised over the course of these last 2 or 3 years since we started the Scott in Hollywood series, that this is, that I've waited until now to invite you to watch Shadowlands, a movie about C.S. Lewis. I think that's pretty amazing on my part that I've waited this long to have you read this movie. So can I have a round of applause, please? Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Shadowlands is a movie that is based upon primarily a script written by William Nicholson, who presented different scripts for different productions of this story. The first was a TV movie that Nicholson wrote that was released on TV back in the late 1980s, mid-1980s. And then a script was then transformed into a script for a play that ended up running in New York City on Broadway. And then following that, the script was then transformed again into this movie that stars Anthony Hopkins and Deborah Winger. A movie directed by Richard Attenborough. So it's one of the great directors of cinema. And a movie that was, I think, very well received for the most part. Reviewers gave it, I think, a very high grade. Roger Ebert called it an intelligent, moving, and beautifully acted movie. Another reviewer called it a soap opera with a Rhodes Scholarship. I think you might agree that it's a beautifully filmed movie and really does bring us back to that beautiful landscape of England and certainly the charming chambers and halls of Oxford and the quaint places where good Englishmen lived, as did Lewis and his brother in that little house that is called the Kilns. Actually, that was the name of the home that Lewis and his brother lived in for a long time. I heard an earlier conversation before we got going, wondering if this film was actually filmed inside the home that Lewis lived in, and the answer is no, it isn't. It wasn't, though it certainly takes on a lot of the similarities of that home. And those of you who have been to it, Lewis lived in a pretty small house, very charming, very small bedrooms, and so it's certainly well represented in the movie. The movie was nominated for 2 Academy Awards and won neither of them. The first for Best Adapted Screenplay, and the second for Best Actress for Deborah Winger. Anthony Hopkins did not receive a nomination for his acting in this movie. Some say primarily because he was nominated for Best Actor for another movie that same year, The Remains of the Day. And he didn't win the award for that role, but it goes to show that he's a pretty adept actor, and I think certainly he shows off his acting skill in this really great performance. You know, what I thought it might be best to do is to talk about the nature of watching a movie that's based upon a true story. You know, I think even in this movie, it says early on that it's based on a true story. And there's lots of movies, of course, that are based on true stories. But I think what it does is that it highlights the reality that when you're watching a movie that's based upon a true story, it isn't necessarily always going to tell you the true story. And that a lot of times what is important to do is to sort of separate the narrative of the movie and the episode to which the movie is pointing, and to understand it in relationship to maybe what truly took place in the life of the people it's seeking to, whose story it's seeking to tell. And that's not anything different in this movie. While I think the storyline that is taken in this movie is pretty close to being, capturing the gist of the story, there are lots of little variations from the real story that we'll talk about a little bit. So, but one of the challenges in a movie like this is I feel compelled to sort of speak about sort of the true nature of events that took place in order so that we don't get mixed up in the conversation around what really took place, what really happened, as opposed to what story is being told in the movie. And I think there's a compelling story that's been told in the movie, but it's important to kind of distinguish what that story is from maybe the facts of the story itself. Does that make any sense? Give me a thumbs up if I'm making any sense there. One of the things that drives me crazy about Zoom is as I teach, I usually look forward to the instant feedback of my class, but I don't really quite get that with this because you're all on mute. So, which, you know, I guess it's kind of like preaching. I put you all on mute when you're sitting in the pews and I just preach at you for 20 minutes or so. So let me give you a little bit of background about the real story of Joy Davidman and C.S. Lewis. Many of you may know a bunch of this. Some of you have participated in our C.S. Lewis reading group that meets every other week. And this is a shameless plug for you to join us in that every other Tuesday. We meet next Tuesday, and we're talking about a book called God in the Dock, which is a collection of essays by Lewis. So for those of you who have been a part of that, a lot of this may come to you as being pretty familiar. Let me just tell you a little bit about Joy Davidman. Joy Davidman Gresham, as she was often referred to, taking her husband's last name as her last name. She was born in 1915 and she passed away in 1960. So she died very young, 45 years old. She was a child prodigy, brilliant. There are records that she held an IQ of 150. And I know that's not as high as some of you, but she was a brilliant young woman. She got her master's degree at the age of 20 from Columbia University in New York City in English literature. So she was a writer. She really began as a poet, won some Young Poet Awards, won the same Young Poet Award as did Robert Frost years before her. And she began to explore with her great intellectual mind all sorts of different systems and philosophies and such. She pretty quickly on, even though she was born Jewish, she quickly adopted an atheistic worldview, became an atheist, and then joined the American Communist Party. And so she ventured through exploring, really impassioned around how do we create a society that provides equal opportunity for all of its citizens. And that was a sort of a driving cause for her, and that's what kind of led her toward the exploration and participation in the Communist Party in the United States. She was married to Bill Gresham. They were married in 1942, and they had a fairly troubling marriage, had 2 sons. That's one of the distinctions that we need to make. Joy had 2 boys, and she had them her whole life. And so that's one liberty that the movie takes, is that they paint Joy with having just 1 son. And so I'm not sure all the reasons behind that, but she had 2 boys. She and Bill had 2 boys. And they were both writers, and they were, as I said, kind of evolved into having somewhat of a strained, some would say even violent relationship that caused Joy greater and greater concern. I wanted to share with you an experience that Joy had that I think is helpful to kind of, again, you don't pick this up in the movie. Joy had one of these supernatural spiritual conversions that is almost impossible to describe, though she attempts to do so in a book that, in a chapter of a book that she was asked to submit in terms of people who came to faith. And it all happened during an episode when she and her husband were having difficulties, and her husband was having a near nervous breakdown. And he calls her from work and explains to her that he doesn't know what he's going to do, and he hangs up the phone, and he doesn't come home, and she gets her worried, and she's fairly certain that maybe he's going to somehow end his life somewhere. And and then she writes this. Let me see here. There followed a day of frantic and vain telephoning. By nightfall, there was nothing left to do but wait and see if Bill turned up alive or dead. I put the babies to sleep and waited. For the first time in my life, I felt helpless. For the first time, my pride was forced to admit that I was not, after all, the master of my fate and the captain of my soul. All my defenses, the walls of arrogance and cocksureness and self-love behind which I had hid from God, went down momentarily, and God came in. How can one describe the direct perception of God? It is infinite, unique. There are no words, there are no comparisons. Can one scoop up the sea in a teacup? Those who have known God will understand me. The others, I find, can neither listen nor understand. There was that night a person with me in the room, directly present to my consciousness, a person so real that all my previous life was by comparison mere shadow play, and I myself was more alive than I had ever been. It was like waking from sleep. So intense a life cannot be endured for long by flesh and blood. We must ordinarily take our life watered down, diluted as it were, by time and space and matter. My perception of God lasted perhaps a half minute. In that time, however, many things happened. I forgave some of my enemies. I understood that God had always been there, and that since childhood I had been pouring half my energy into the task of keeping him out. I saw myself as I really was, with dismay and repentance, and seeing I changed. I've been turned into a different person since that half minute, everyone tells me. So quite a dramatic experience that Joy has, and it leads her to basically fall on her knees and pray for Jesus to come into her life. And from that moment, she begins this journey. Now, good news is that Bill had come home later in the evening. And as it turns out, the two of them they began this sort of joint journey down a path of spiritual discovery that led them to, of all places, a Presbyterian church. Hey. All roads lead to the Presbyterian churches. And they found there a great pastor, and they went to church faithfully. And it was that pastor who slipped to Joy a book written by this fella named C.S. Lewis. And she began to read Lewis and began to devour just about everything that he wrote. And as the story, and then it's really at that point, unfortunately, Bill kind of slipped off the path, and he began to be unfaithful in the relationship, and life got pretty difficult. And that really is sort of part of the impetus for Joy to take her trip over to England with both of her boys. And as we see in the story, that's when she finds Lewis and introduces herself to him. And then, the story unfolds after that. She and Lewis married in April of 1956, civilly, as was presented in the movie. And then a year later, after Joy had been diagnosed with inoperable bone cancer, Lewis and she marry again, this time in the eyes of the church. There's an interesting story behind that second marriage. Of course, the Church of England prohibited marriage of divorced people. And Joy had by that time been divorced from Bill. And so Lewis went to the bishop and asked if he could, given the circumstances of Joy, being diagnosed with cancer, would they grant an exception to their rule, and would they allow this great, Christian scholar to marry this divorced American Jew, former Jew, and former atheist? And the bishop's answer was, no, we won't let that happen. And so Lewis went to his friend, who was a rector of a local parish, a fellow by the name of Peter Bide, and he asked Bide if he would marry them. And Bide said, no, I can't, because I know I'll get in trouble with the bishop. And so, and then the next day, Bide has this jab of conscience, and he goes back to Lewis and says, I'll go ahead and do that. I feel like this is the right thing to do. This is an extraordinary circumstance, and this is the one thing that Joy wants, is to be married in the eyes. And so performs their wedding. A week later, Peter Bide gets a call from the bishop. And so he goes to the bishop's office and sits down, and he bares his soul and explains all the reasons for why he felt he had to marry C.S. Lewis and his companion Joy Davidman. And once he gets done with that whole explanation, the bishop says, "That wasn't why I called you to my office." He said, "But the reason I called you to my office was I wanted to offer you the largest church in the diocese, and I'm still offering it to you, even though you've gone against canon law, as it were, in the Church of England." So interesting little story behind their wedding in 1957. A little difference between fact and fiction. Actually, that trip that they took off into the countryside and had that, important time in that beautiful valley that's portrayed in the painting of Lewis's in his home. The truth is that didn't take place. Instead, they traveled to Greece. And it was Joy's great wish that they go to Greece and spend a week or so, which they did actually only 3 months before Joy died. They went in April of 1960, and she died in July of that same year. So that's a little bit of background on Joy and their coming together. And then just real quickly, just to give you a little bit more background on Lewis, born in Belfast, his mother died at the age of 9, which was obviously a very pivotal moment in his life and in his brother's life. Soon thereafter, his father was overwhelmed with being a father, and that led to some estrangement between him and his 2 boys. Lewis, almost days after his mother died, was set off to boarding school, and he lived several years in different boarding schools, which was a terrible experience for him. At the end of the day, he finally got tutored by a really, a good man that allowed him to be prepared to go to Oxford. As soon as he got to Oxford, he was called up to go to World War I, and he was a soldier in World War I for, I think, a little bit more than a year. When he was wounded, he was brought back. He then, subsequent to that, carried through with a promise that he made to a friend of his who was also called up to the war. The 2 of them had made a promise to each other that the other would take care of the other's remaining parent if the other passed away. Well, in this instance, Lewis's friend was killed in the war, and Lewis took in his mother, Mrs. Moore, shortly after the war. And the 2 of them lived together for a little bit more than 30 years. They shared the same home together. There's a lot of speculation as to what the nature of that relationship was, that maybe something more than simply a custodianship of Lewis and she, but no one quite knows for sure. Lewis himself converted in 1931, and there's too long a story to tell about that. He was influenced greatly by a group of professors that are represented in the movie, but they're not represented by name. But he spent a lot of time with all those guys in the pub. Lewis would meet with them once a week in this pub called the Eagle and Child, which they affectionately referred to as the Bird and the Baby. And they would sit there and drink pretty much half of the afternoon and share ideas about the literature and the books that they're both reading and writing. It included J.R.R. Tolkien, Charles Williams, and several other men who were influential in the world of literature back in that day and age. Lewis was never granted a professorship at Oxford. There was a lot of jealousy about his popularity, so Oxford never gave him a professorship. And it was Cambridge that came swooping in toward the latter part of his career and offered him a professorship. So he left Oxford and went to Cambridge for the last bit of his teaching career. And it was at that point in time that Joy was a part of his life, and Joy lived at the Kilns in Oxford while Lewis went back and forth between Cambridge and Oxford during the years of their relationship and their marriage. So a couple of themes to talk about before we open it up for some discussion. Lewis, the movie seems to dwell on this juxtaposition between Lewis's intellectual understanding of suffering and pain, and then his subsequent experience of suffering and pain. So if you recall, Lewis is portrayed several times as giving a lecture about pain and suffering. If you recall that, where he talks about pain is the great megaphone to arouse our attention. That pain is this way by which, the maker chisels us and, creates us and makes us into stronger people. And then, juxtapose that, and all that are quotations from Lewis's early Christian book called The Problem of Pain, wherein he sort of postulates why pain is a part of our lives. And he basically seeks to explain that pain is God's way of forming us and making us into stronger people, and strangely enough, as a way of loving us. I don't myself necessarily agree with that particular take on it, but what the movie does is it tries to set up this idea that Lewis really only knew pain through an intellectual pursuit, as something that he understood up in his mind, but that he necessarily hadn't really experienced. Now, the truth of the matter is, this is a guy who's lost his mother at the age of 9, who fought in World War I. So it's not as if he never had experienced pain, but that he seems to have this effort, this need to sort of explain why pain exists. So juxtapose that to his own experience of pain with the illness and the death of Joy. And all that is captured in a book that Lewis wrote subsequent to Joy's death called A Grief Observed, wherein he in a very raw way shares with the public his own doubt about faith. Here's this great Christian giant, and when he gets to this point of losing the love of his life, his faith starts to unravel, and he's very transparent about that in this book called A Grief Observed. And I'll just read you a quick little quip from that book. He actually wrote it under a pseudonym because he didn't want anyone to know that he wrote it. And it wasn't until after he died that his own name was put on the book. And it came as a great surprise to so many people that this giant of the Christian faith was expressing these doubts. So early in the book, as he's talking about the death of Joy, he says this: "Meanwhile, where is God? This is one of the most disquieting symptoms of grief. When you are happy, so happy that you have no sense of needing God, so happy that you're tempted to feel God's claims upon you as an interruption, if you remember yourself and turn to him with gratitude and praise, you will be, or so it feels, welcomed with open arms. But go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain, and what do you find? A door slammed in your face, and the sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. And after that, silence. You may as well turn away. The longer you wait, the more emphatic the silence will become. There are no lights in the windows. It might be an empty house. Was it ever inhabited? It seemed so once, and that seeming was as strong as this. What can this mean? Why is he so present a commander in our time of prosperity and so very absent a help in time of trouble?" So talk about raw and talk about honest doubt. Lewis felt the need to be able to express that, perhaps as a way of helping us not to feel so alone in the struggles that we all go through with our faith and our doubt and our wonderment around God's presence in our life. The other theme, so there's this the suffering and feeling and intellect, and how one copes with one's suffering and pain is one theme, and then the other theme is the illustrations of the nature of love, right? So Lewis is one who participated in a variety of levels of love. In fact, we're going to be preaching this month on the 4 Greek words for love, phileo and storge and eros and agape love. And in many ways, those loves are exhibited in this movie. Lewis has this great love of friends, and he has this group called the Inklings that he spends a lot of time with. He has this great friendship with his brother, who they're companions their whole life, even though his brother was sort of a hopeless alcoholic and had a lot of his own issues, but Lewis and he were very, very close. He, of course, experiences this great romantic love with Joy. And then, of course, there is that whole sacrificial love that, one gives one's life over to another, that we can see in this story as well. But so there's this interplay of the natures of love that go on in the story, which I think, make it a really compelling story for us as we try to get in touch with our own experience of the various forms of love that are made available to us. So I think that's about all I've got to say. So I would love for you, if you are inclined to, let us know whether you have a question or a comment for us to talk a little bit about what your experience of the movie was, and what questions you might have about Lewis and about Joy, or about scenes in the movie. There are some just wonderfully touching scenes of Lewis and his relationship with so many different people, and of course this relationship he has with Joy. And Joy brings a very certain frankness to the relationship that Lewis is posited as this fairly inhibited person, and Joy is anything but inhibited. And I think it's true. But one thing it doesn't point out about Joy is, and one of the things that attracted Lewis to Joy was that she was his intellectual equal. I mean, he was probably smarter than he was, and he was so grateful to have. That's where their relationship started, and then from there grew into this great relationship of affection. So.
Gary Olson has a question. Gary.
Thank you, Gary. I see your question. What happened to Joy's other son? So good question. She had 2 sons, as we said. There's Douglas Gresham, who is featured in the movie, and then there is his older brother, David, who, and some people posit the reason why David doesn't stay in the story as he did. Actually, David was in the original script, the 2 sons, but that once it got to the movie, they dropped David and only kept Douglas. David, shortly after he grew up, and the Lewis family continued to, watch over the boys. Lewis died 3 years after Joy died. Lewis died the same day that JFK was assassinated. Actually, 3 famous people died on that very same day. C.S. Lewis, JFK, and Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World. They all died at the same. There's actually a book imagining the conversation between the 3 of them in heaven, but it's not that good. So, but David, after in growing up, he basically shunned the whole Lewis tradition and the whole Lewis background and the whole Lewis estate. Ended up going to India and having a life there. He moved to several parts around the world. I don't believe he's with us anymore. His brother Douglas, quite the opposite, clung to the Lewis tradition and the Lewis estate. And he's written books about Lewis, and he's a great advocate for for what he received from Lewis, and he's a great interpreter of the Lewis canon, and that's available for lots of folks to read about. So, 5 years ago, was it? Yeah, 5 years ago. No, heavens, 7 years ago. I had the privilege of going to London and to participate in the 50th anniversary celebration of Lewis's life on November 22nd, 2003, which was the 50th anniversary of his death. And Douglas Gresham was there and participated in the ceremony of laying a stone in the floor of Westminster Abbey in Poets' Corner to commemorate Lewis's contribution to the world of letters. So I see another question here. Were we the only ones who, by mistake, it now seems, watched the 1989 version with Claire Bloom as Joy, and which featured both of Joy's sons? Yes, you are not the only one. There are others who actually watched that first movie, which I think when you compare the two movies, you'll probably be disappointed that you watched that first movie, which I don't think holds much of a candle to the second movie. So my apologies. I tried to distinguish the movie when I listed the movies by putting the year 1993, but I know that there are more than one of you that started off with that earlier version with Claire Bloom. So my apologies for that. Any other questions that you have or comments? Come on now.
I'm just going to say, Steve, I'm so glad that you told us about Joy and her educational pursuits. And because when the two of them met, they were at opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of, she was so bright, so quick, and so articulate in what she could come up with. And yet she just was carrying on in this very matter-of-fact way with what she was doing. And so they really were intellectually matched, as you were saying. I found that interesting. I did not notice that.
Yeah, and I think in a sense, the movie does a little disservice to Joy. I don't think it really accentuates well enough what her intellectual capacity was. Even when they first, are getting to know each other, she sort of downplays her poetry. And kind of, sort of in an embarrassed way, shares what actually was a really good poem, and in fact, she was noted for it. So I think there's an interesting agenda there. I'm not sure exactly what that agenda was. That we're more interested in making her into a brash New York, in your face kind of person, when actually I think she was far deeper than that, and certainly far broader than that. So
Jean Powell has a question, and then Charlie Hausner.
Okay, I see Jean's question. Did Lewis publish anything on her death? Yes, he did. He published a book called Letters to Malcolm, and they are and the letters to Malcolm are actually fictional letters through which he seeks to sort of speak about his understanding of prayer. So that is one, I think, book he wrote after Grief Observed, And let's make sure everybody mutes themselves so that we don't hear the background noise. So yes, he did publish after that. And I want to say also that Joy was an inspiration for some of the books he published prior to her death, including Till We Have Faces, which in my estimation is probably my most favorite of his books. It's a novel that Joy inspired him to write. Also a book called The Four Loves, which is Lewis's attempt to sort of unpack the 4 Greek words for love that I was just mentioning a while ago, which is a classic on the nature of love. So it just goes to show the the relationship that they had and how they really were together, made each other better by a connection of both mind and heart. So I see some more questions. Do you think
Hausner first. And then-
Muted.
Oh, hi, it's Carol. I have a question. Am I on? Can you hear me?
Yes.
I wondered if you could explain the significance of the title, Shadowlands.
Good, good.
Yeah, thank you. Lewis, and everybody check your microphones because I'm hearing some clearing of one's throat and all that stuff. Lewis he had a real, he was what's called a Platonist, meaning he really adhered to the philosophy of Plato. And one of the sort of the tenets of Platonic philosophy is that all of what we experience in this world is really just the shadow of a greater reality. And that as, whether we experience love in this world, whether we experience human relationships in this world, joy in this world, so on and so forth, that all those are mere shadows of something far greater, something deeper, something. And Lewis, people would say he was a Christian Platonist in the sense that Lewis projected that out into our experience, what we will someday experience in heaven. And that what we experience in this world, i.e. the joy that we experience or the love that Lewis experienced with Joy, is merely a shadow of a greater reality that we will soon experience. So, the title, Shadowlands, is to suggest that we are living presently in a shadowland, awaiting something greater, that the joy we experience now will be exponentially greater once we come into that new land, that new reality that Lewis would say we would find in heaven. So,
Mary Haley has a question.
Mary Haley, what's your question?
I found it interesting that his relationship with the student, you see first when the student is sleeping in his class, and then he keeps reappearing with certain vignettes, but I got distracted by the love story and didn't really follow that to its completion. Could you comment a little bit more about that relationship?
I didn't catch that first part, Mary. Could you say it
The
again?
student who was falling asleep in the class,
Yes.
he kind of like kicked him out of the class.
Right.
And then this student keeps reappearing throughout the movie. And in the end, I think they see him on the train and he's a teacher. And
Right.
I wondered, am I missing something? I got distracted by the love story, I think.
You really didn't miss anything, but I think the reason why that character is in the movie is it's meant to illustrate the relationship Lewis had with his students, and Lewis was notorious for following his students' lives because he cared about them. And there's a wonderful example of a student who failed all of her sort of final exams at the end of her Oxford, her time in Oxford, such that, she really kind of came out of Oxford with really nothing to show for it. And Lewis took her under his wing and basically championed her into, you know, the next chapters of her life, all the way to the point that she asked Lewis to be the godfather of her children, and they maintained a correspondence with each other, you know, until the end of his life. Lewis wrote. Lewis was a prolific letter writer, and he never. You couldn't write Lewis a letter without him writing it back. And some of you have heard the story I told in one of my devotions a few months ago, that, and it is a great illustration of that. Lewis got a letter after he had started publishing the Chronicles of Narnia. He got a letter from a young girl from Sarasota. And she wrote him a letter asking him about one of his stories for children. And so Lewis wrote her back. And then she wrote him back and asked him another question. And he wrote her back. And she wrote him again, and he wrote her again. And this happened over the course of the rest of his life 27 times. We have 27 letters that Lewis wrote to this girl in Sarasota, Florida, lived on Siesta Key. And that's just an example of the personal interest that Lewis took, not only in students, but really anybody that desired to correspond with him. So thank you for asking that, Mary. It's a great question. I see Holly Miller has a question. Do you feel that the movie portrayed C.S. Lewis accurately? That's a great question. I would say that in many respects it does. Lewis had a very deep, grovelly voice. So Anthony Hopkins doesn't necessarily nail the Lewis voice. But I think in many respects, it's a fairly fair representation of him. Lewis was accused of being a misogynist, having very, paternalistic and patronizing views of women. And I think that's probably half earned. But in other respects, I think what this movie projects is that, Lewis had also, an openness to women, and it certainly is proven through the relationships and correspondence he had with, women all throughout his life and throughout his letter writing career. So, I would say that for the most part, it's a fairly decent portrayal of Lewis. The other, what do you got here, Mengi?
Lee has a question there too.
Yes.
Yes, Lee, go ahead.
Yes, it's kind of a two-parter. Was Lewis intimidated at all by Joy? And was he kind of in denial of his love for her for quite some time?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure it's one I can even answer. I can imagine him being intimidated by Joy, in part because perhaps there was this sort of thread of misogyny that he carried, and he may have been intimidated, especially because she was a woman and she was, going toe to toe with him on a bunch of different things. There's that great scene in the movie where she, calls out the one professor for this very, patronizing comment that he makes, and she sort of calls him on the carpet. I wouldn't be surprised if actually that exchange would have been closer between Lewis and Joy. That would have been a way she would have called him on perhaps a bunch of different things he thought and felt. Was he in denial of his love? My sense of it is that Lewis grew, that his love for her was, it was platonic, and it was more based upon friendship, sort of the phileo, Greek understanding of love. I think he grew to know her and love her as a friend. And I think that once she became sick, he began to realize, I think the relationship itself grew into something more. And I think maybe he began to realize that he had greater feelings for her than just, I mean, it goes to show, right? When she wants to stay in the country, and the only way that they can think about her staying in the country is for them to get married, you know, they only do it civilly, right? And then a year later, they do it, in the eyes of the church. Now, part of that may have been they didn't think they had a chance of doing it in the eyes of the church, but so yeah, so it's a hard one to nail down, but that would be my guess on it. I see Don Scalencamp's got a question.
Yes, Steve, could you comment a little bit about Lewis's time at Magdalen College? It's just mentioned in passing in the movie.
Yeah, he's actually, strange, coincidentally, the college at which he taught in Oxford, you know, Oxford is basically a collection of colleges. It's about 100 colleges that form one university. And Lewis taught at Magdalen College. It's spelled Magdalen, but it's actually pronounced Magdalen. And that's where, you know, he basically held court. He was a fellow at Magdalen. As I said, he wasn't a full professor. That was something they chose not to give him. But when he was offered a job, and here's an interesting story about his being offered a job at Cambridge. Cambridge came to him and said, "Hey, we'll make you a full professor if you come to Cambridge." It's sort of like a stick in the eye of the Oxford people. If you're not a professor, we're gonna steal them from you. And Lewis really struggled over it, and he turned them down. And the reason he turned them down was that he didn't want to move to Cambridge. He wanted to stay in Oxford. But he didn't say that was the reason. And so Cambridge, after he said no, went on with their search and began to entertain other candidates and offered the professorship to another person, a woman. And I'm afraid to say I don't remember her name. And so they offer her the job of professorship. And then it was a week or two later that J.R. Tolkien realized that there had been this communication issue with Lewis not telling them why he didn't want to go to Cambridge, and understanding that he probably could live in Oxford, even though, and take the train back and forth between Oxford and Cambridge. So Tolkien goes on behalf of his friend Lewis to the people at Cambridge and say, you know, the reason why he turned you down was because he didn't want to leave Oxford. And they said, well, we could have worked that out. He could have taken the train back and forth, so on and so forth. So the word gets out to this woman who had been offered the Cambridge professorship that Lewis had turned it down for the wrong reasons. So she goes to the powers that be at Cambridge, and she says, I can't take this professorship if it's going to keep Lewis from taking the professorship. So she steps down in order for Lewis to take the professorship. So he takes it, and he ends up his teaching career going back and forth between Oxford and Cambridge. So, and the other irony is that the college at the university in Cambridge was Magdalen College. So there were there was Magdalen College and Magdalen College, and Lewis taught at both of them, one at Oxford, one at Cambridge. So.
Greg Ryan has a question, and then Faye Mercer has a question.
All right, Greg.
Thank you. I have a comment. In watching the movie, I found myself being really taken by Joy, her personality, her emotional and spiritual life. And I was deeply struck by what appeared to be her extraordinary courage that she had as a woman back in the day to here she was living with a very abusive alcoholic husband who was physically abusive to her own children, which can be very traumatic for a woman, for a family, for the children. And yet she did not appear, at least in the movie, to be bitter, as many people might expect. Courage to be in action, given all of those circumstances, having light dream of a marriage to a man with children ended, terminated in such a traumatic, abusive way. She continued to live hope and faith, and she continued to be in action, and she continued to reach out, even to the point of going to England, pursuing her relationship with Lewis. And then, besides that courage for a woman in that day to act in that way, her ability to love, and it appeared that, to me at least, that she loved Lewis unconditionally, which really swept Lewis off his feet, surprised him, moved him deeply, at her ability to understand what he was trying to say, where he's at emotion with his love life and his relationship with her, and her ability to unconditionally accept where he was at. He went to get married, and he gave his reasons, and she said, okay, I understand. And it was extraordinary. The unconditional love which swept Lewis off his feet and allowed him then to be transformed. The whole love relationship, her ability to accept him where he was at without expectations, without trying to fix him or change him, was what appeared to totally transform Lewis, which we all know deeply affected his life in the end. It was beautiful to watch. I just wanted to make that comment of joy.
Thank you, Greg. And you were breaking up a little bit, but I think I got the gist of what you were saying about Joy and coming out of that terribly abusive relationship with Bill, and then in a very real way unconditionally loving Lewis. I would agree with all of what you said, and I think really it goes to show the strength of this person, right? I mean, that she in the 1940s and 50s is really taking some control of her life and not allowing probably a lot of the preconditions of that time to keep her from pursuing what was going to be in the best interest of herself and the best interest of her kids, and not worried about even what Lewis thought about her, but that she was willing to pursue that relationship. And we can't forget that, as I mentioned about letters, this whole thing began with this correspondence between the two for over the course of 2 years before she actually came to visit him. So in one sense, that friendship was already forming from an epistolary point of view. And then, that was then built on, the relationship was built on top of that to a greater appreciation of each other. So Faye has a question.
Yeah, I don't know if this was just part of the movie, if you can even answer this. I don't even know if it was a quote actually from C.S. Lewis, but I had a hard time understanding some of the words sometimes, and I kept replaying it. And at the very end, after I think it was at the point where he and his boy were walking down the meadow after Joy died, there was a comment made, and it said, boy chooses something, and man chooses suffering. Did you get that? And I didn't get what boy chooses.
Safety.
What?
Boy chooses safety.
Safety.
That's it, safety.
Yeah.
Safety.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah.
And a man chooses suffering. It's not a direct quote of Lewis's. And I think with the movie, what they basically did was they took many sentiments of Lewis and they made them quotes. And so I think in that instance, that's an illustration of that. He has another quote about prayer in the movie, and I went looking for it, and it's nowhere to be found in any of Lewis's writings, but sure sounds good. So, but that's some of the places that that the writer and I'm sure the director took. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? These are great questions.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
I was knocked over by this movie last night. I thought it was fantastic. I do lectures on films for the Carl Jung Society, and I will use this film. The themes in it, but I've also been, I like Socrates' allegory of the cave, which is about our life as shadows. And to me, Joy was not a shadow. She was reality, and it got him to escape from a shadow concept to really what love was and all that. And it was just, it was a beautiful film, I couldn't get the film. I finally got it on YouTube, but after the film, there was an interview with Douglas for a half an hour. And they asked him what he thought of C.S. Lewis when he first met him. And he said, well, I expected this Superman. Here's this real plain, ordinary man. and he had to be won over by Lewis. And they showed us a picture of Joy and C.S. Lewis, and they're both very plain people. And Hollywood projected this thing of the the movie stars and all that, but I thought it was a great movie and a lot about shadows and what is reality. My picture's not on, but can you still hear me?
I see you.
Okay.
Yep.
Anyway, but the themes in it, love, death, pain, suffering, losses. There was a lot of kisses. It was interesting. It was kind of cute where they used the little thing, a little kiss on the cheek and when they were finally in the bed, they're kissing each other. I just thought it was cute, and happiness, and crying and learning to release your pain and whatnot. I just thought it was a great movie. I was astounded. I thought, there's another CS thing. This is Steve's buddy, but no, I thought it was a great movie. I got a lot out. I only saw it once, and I have to see movies 2 or 3 times before I sort of get a handle on it. But I like the concept of the shadow. I thought it was a great movie, and I guess she got a Joy. Winger got the best adapted screenplay. No, she won she won something. Got 2 awards. Deborah Winger got the best actress award for that film movie.
She was nominated. She was nominated, but didn't win it.
Oh, you're right. She was just a nominee.
Yeah.
I thought she was good. That's all I have to say, Steve.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah.
One quick, and I know we have one more question after this, and then we'll wrap it up. One quick little story about Joy. They were at the kilns, living at the kilns, and there was this little lake in the back of the kilns that they used to like to go back to and walk around. And at one point, they're walking together, and I'm not sure why, but Joy liked to. Oh, I do know why. Joy liked to carry a rifle. She in order to chase away some of the to shoot it, not to shoot at, but to shoot it off in order to scare away some of the critters that were on the grounds. So they're walking, and she's got this rifle, and they are approached by a man who's got a bow and arrow, and the man sort of doesn't seem to be in his right mind, and he draws back the arrow like he's going to shoot one of these two. And Lewis jumps in front of Joy in order to defend her, and in order to sort of tell this guy, back off, get off our property, you have no business being here. And as he's doing that, Joy screams out, move! And Lewis turns back at her, and she says, move, you're in my way, I'm gonna shoot him. And so fortunately, she doesn't do that. And the guy, goes and runs off. So that's another illustration of the strength of this woman who is not afraid to aim her gun at somebody. So Francis Long, one more question. What do you got?
I would like you to comment on the scene where Jack is talking, is it to Christopher, the tall, sarcastic professor? And he's pondering this love that he is now feeling and trying to deal with. And he asks Christopher how he feels about his life. And Christopher says, well, I am what I am, as opposed to the world. I am what I am, and the world is what it is. And sort of, and there you have it. And then Jack says, well, don't you feel that there's waste? And he says, but of course.
Don't you feel there's, I'm sorry?
Waste.
Waste?
And he says, but of course.
Huh.
I thought that was really poignant.
Yeah, to be sure. I think, I think really the background of that, the exchange, that's a fictional character. And in many respects, that guy represents sort of a compendium of the different friendships that Lewis had in that group called the Inklings. And Lewis was often, it was viewed by many of his closest friends as too eagerly wading in too deep on issues of theology and religion. It's interesting, Lewis became a Christian in 1931, and it was as early as 1936, 5 years later, that he began, primarily being a Christian writer. And he waded in pretty deep, pretty quick. One of his first books was a book of science fiction based upon sort of Christian themes. And then from there, he jumps into this book about pain and suffering and why do we have it. And then from there, he writes a book about the devil called the Screwtape Letters. And he was viewed by many of his friends as having jumped into the deep end too early, that he was providing easier answers than really what the questions warranted. So that exchange, I think, is an illustration of that back and forth that Lewis had with his colleagues, many of whom were somewhat, mystified over his eagerness to represent the Christian faith, having just adopted it just a few years prior. In part, I think the reason Lewis did it was because he had a very rational philosophical bent to himself, and that was often what propelled him to talk about religion, because when he was converted, it began to philosophically make sense to him. It began to rationally make sense to him, and he felt that there was a dearth of literature out there that made a rational and philosophical defense of the faith. So that exchange, I think, illustrated that back and forth. So, all right, I know I've kept you to 7:45, and I want to say thank you. I want to let you know about next week. Our next movie is a movie called The Elephant Man, and I don't think you'll have any confusion over this one. I think there's only one film version of this from 1980, so we're going back even further. A year where some great movies came out, one of which we've already talked about, The Ordinary People. And it is, I believe, available on Amazon Prime. So if you're wanting to find the live stream version of it, I think you can, not the live stream, but the internet version of it, you can find it on Amazon Prime. Again, a story based upon a true story. And so we'll talk a little bit about that next week as we look at what really took place and how it's portrayed in the movie. Powerful movie, a hard movie to watch. It's filled with great pathos, and but I think a one worthy for us to view, and hopefully will inspire us some great conversation. Then the following week, we're going to take a look at a even more difficult movie, 12 Years a Slave, that came out in 2013. a movie that I believe is available on Netflix. So we'll try to keep you current with how to get these movies as we get to them each week. And but thank you for being here. It's so great to see all of you, and thank you for hanging on. And I hope that you found this helpful. And if anything, I'm giving you a reason not to get bored. You at least got one movie each week you can watch, and that way we'll get something to do, and hopefully the discussion is helpful to you as well.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you.
Oh,
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
my pleasure. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for your questions. And let me close this with prayer, and I will let you all go off on your merry way. Thanks, oh God, for this chance to have a conversation. We pray that you will allow the themes and perspectives that we've received from this movie to be good seed for us, that it may implant in us ways by which we can grow to become more like you. We thank you for this great story of C.S. Lewis and Joy Davidman, and for their love and for their struggle and for their understanding of you, and pray that we may allow that story to influence our own story. And we pray your blessing upon the rest of this evening and this week. And we ask it all in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Good to
you.
see you. See you next week.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Steve.